Hey, welcome to the cutting room floor. Each week we come together, Charlie, me, Rick, Hayden, and Ryan, and talk about our sermon from the week. And a lot of times what we want to put in the sermon doesn't make it. It's on the cutting room floor. But as we start this season of Advent, especially this story from Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 1:18 through 25, the birth story, we wanted to just share a little bit more about the sermon. Now, we're reviewing this before we preached it on Sunday. This is a Tuesday before Sunday. But you'll be seeing it after the sermon. So if you haven't seen the sermon, of course, you can go back and listen to it, or you can just listen to us ramble about the sermon for a moment. So we've just reviewed, but what thoughts y'all have as we start?
I think the thing that stood out to me the most in this story is what you emphasized, the do not be afraid. Mm-hmm. Because the angel wouldn't have reason to say that unless there was going to be reason to be afraid. And so I really like that this story approaches the practical aspect of being faithful to what God's called you to do, even though it doesn't make sense, and even though other people aren't going to understand it. I just really appreciate just how real that is in this Christmas story.
I think the interesting thing for me on Matthew, again, it is fascinating to me that Matthew focuses on Joseph, Luke on Mary. Both have an angelic visit, but we only hear one side on each. But then in Matthew, Joseph basically just disappears after this, after the wise men. It's just, he's no more. But he plays such an important role in the very beginning of the story, and the focus is on his lineage. But then it kind of goes away.
Even in this culture, the act of humility to take ownership of a child that is not yours according to the cultural viewpoint, the humility on that part, but then just you see in the little bit that we know about Joseph, his sacrificial love as far as Mary, but also Jesus, moving them to Egypt, getting them to the inn, all of those things, you just see this humble, sacrificial love from Joseph.
Yeah, I think it's so cool that Joseph, he almost becomes the first one to be called to be unashamed of Jesus. It's a very shameful situation.
That's a great point.
And Joseph is the one that he's the first one to be unashamed of Jesus. Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. I like that. That's really good.
Thoughts, Ryan, from what you're going to do Sunday or anything else of the story?
I like the points that y'all made about Joseph, but I think the part that I really loved is when you talked about Malachi and how this is the fulfillment of the Old Testament and kind of this bridging of everything that we read about, this culmination that's being built up in the Old Testament, just over and over and over and almost in every book to this one culmination point of Jesus coming to the earth. And so I really want to emphasize that, and just emphasize just this fact that God took human flesh to be with us, and what that means for us. And so I'm excited to kind of dive into that one.
Go ahead.
For Matthew, it starts with, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. I mean, it's making that claim from the very beginning, so it lands us on where Matthew is going in the story. This is Messiah, even in his title, God with us, and that God saves. To me, and again, it's, like you said, the fulfillment of that Old Testament prophecy. It's one grand story going through.
Yeah. I was just going to say, going back to what Brian was saying about the Malachi, the surely day is coming. I've been reading about that. I've been studying on prayer and just how to approach prayer, intercessory prayer. And one of the books I was reading talks about the birth of Jesus and how, the birth of Jesus is really the beginning of the kingdom of God being established on earth, again, as it was in heaven. That's the beginning of that process. And so it's the birth of Jesus that can give us confidence that the kingdom of God is actively at work in our realm, the earth, and so should give us even more confidence to pray and ask and lay claim to that authority of the kingdom. And so it's important to keep in mind.
Even in Malachi, it's chapter 4, verse 1, surely the day is coming. We'll burn like a furnace. It keeps going on. And then verse 5, there's only 6 verses. It says, see, I'll send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. And we'll see in Matthew, again, John the Baptist, Jesus talks about him being the prophet Elijah. Mm-hmm. So that tie-in as well. That's good.
Something that I thought was interesting that you brought up with on page 2, Matthew's narrative being focused on Joseph, and I guess a little bit on the wise men too. I'm sure if you wanted to talk about that later. And then Luke being focused on Mary. And is this the same Matthew that's the tax collector?
As far as we know, yeah.
I just think it's interesting that Matthew's focus is on Joseph, the man of the house, and the wise men who are bringing these gifts, and then Luke, the doctor, focused on
Mary,
on the mom.
On the one who has to do it.
I don't know if that's something that I thought was kind of interesting.
I do think in Matthew's gospel, of course, we know, written to a Jewish audience. It's very Jewish in its nature, starting with the genealogy, starting with trying to make a claim on who this person is, and we have to make a decision. Who is Jesus? Is the evidence here that he is Messiah? But the other thing that I just always find fascinating in Matthew is there's this back and forth between who gets it and who doesn't get it. And the people who should be getting it don't get it. And the people who are outsiders and pagans are the one who get it.
Yeah.
And it starts with a bang right from the beginning with, and Matthew quotes prophecy constantly. I think there's more Old Testament quotes in Matthew than any other gospel, because he's like, this is the fulfillment of all that. Even in verse 22, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord said through the prophet. And then in chapter 2, we see after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, during the time of King Herod, who is the king of the Jews, the Magi, the pagans, come to visit. It's just fascinating juxtaposition between Herod and everyone in Jerusalem who is disturbed by this appearing of a son. And they should be the one who are looking for the appearance of Messiah. And these pagan outsiders who see the sign through a star, and they do what actual discipleship means, and they travel a great distance in order to worship this king. And those who don't have to travel at all and who should be looking for it are the one asking questions: where's it going to take place? All those things. That's which is just fascinating.
It's so fascinating.
And I wish we had time to preach on that chapter 2. But even that, Jerusalem and Bethlehem are 10 miles away.
Yeah, you can see one from the other, right?
It's pretty close. It's not very far away, and yet Herod and all the people of Jerusalem can't be bothered to go check it out. They send the Magi to go check it out.
Yeah.
Wow. I hadn't thought about that.
So here's the one who should be excited. They hear, but they're afraid. Yeah. They're trying to keep the status quo. Of course, they're afraid of Herod because he's a tyrant.
And the Magi come and pay homage to the king.
Yeah. So the outsiders, the pagans, who shouldn't get it, and the insiders who should be getting it don't. And we'll see that constantly. The scribes and Pharisees throughout Matthew who do not give worship, and all the outsiders, the Canaanite woman, all the centurion, the one that says, "Hey, I know that you're in control. You don't even have to come to my house to." They're the ones who exhibit faith and persistence, and the insiders just get offended. Which then begs a question for us: how do we live into that story as well?
That's actually a good segue to one of the questions I want to ask. In a lot of our sermons, we have like a big idea or a next step. So given that, that there's a proper way to respond to the Christmas story, and a way that if you respond, you're going to miss out.
Yeah.
So obviously you're the one that wrote this sermon. Like for you, what would you think is a proper response to hearing this sermon? Like what are you hoping people do as a result of hearing it?
For me, really, even in this Simply Christmas series, it's this idea Well, for Matthew and for the good news for me is that God is with us. That we don't have to be afraid, as we talked about.
Yeah.
God is with us. He saves, and we are a part of that. But the second part, which is really in chapter 2, is how do we respond to that message? Are we going to allow him to be Lord? Are we going to approach him? Are we going to do what it takes to approach, to give gifts, to sacrifice, all those things? Or we've talked about this in the past. In this season we get busy and we miss the whole thing, and we don't want to be like Herod and others. We're apathetic at best and antagonistic at worst. Because, the ending of the King of Jews, Herod, is he kills the children in Bethlehem, which of course is not the proper response to the Messiah being born.
Right.
And they have to go off into Egypt and hide out, which again alludes to Exodus as well. But that's just, I think that's that second story, that second response. How do we respond to this story? Are we going to be? Does it make a difference in our life?
Well, I was thinking about that. I kind of go back to what I said at the beginning with Joseph, that it is simple. It's a father humbly loving who God has called him to humbly love, even though he has no responsibility to that child culturally. And so that's kind of what I took from it, and I hope people take from it, is that in looking at this Simply Christmas story, it's a straightforward story, and there might just be a simple response that God is calling us to. So what is that? To God, but also to our fellow neighbors. So I'm hoping people will think about that. Not just what did I learn, but how should I respond in this Advent season?
Yeah.
Because everybody in the story responded. Herod responded, the wise men responded, Mary responded, Joseph responded. Not all of them responded in the way that God would want them to.
Yeah, because the angel said, "Don't be afraid," and so Joseph took him at his word and wasn't afraid and went forth. This is 2:3. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him.
Yeah.
So, are we going to be disturbed, angered, put off, or are we going to not be afraid and go forth in faith?
And what concerns me about that is it was the people who were closest to the story that missed it. And so for us with Advent, we're so familiar with the story, so close to it. Are we missing because we're so close? Or these people who have a far off view and are looking at from afar, they can see the forest despite the trees.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about not understanding the implications. I don't think that we do, because the story becomes so familiar to us. The Christmas story and the birth story. And sometimes it does feel like it drags. Like when you commit to reading the gospel, start at the beginning, the birth story again. We all know that story. You kind of skim it, but you miss the implications.
Right.
I think Herod and those closest to him.
Absolutely. And then it's fascinating to me because Matthew is the only gospel that has the wise men. Why does he include that? Of course, we know, and we've talked about it, wise men didn't show up at the birth, but at some point after the birth, between birth and 2 years old, of course.
Fiction nativity scenes.
But these astrologers, again, this completely random group coming in from Babylon. This is fascinating.
No, I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. I've heard there's obviously indication that Mary and Joseph were most likely poor or struggling because the sacrifice they offered for Jesus was the 2 turtle doves, which was the option for those who couldn't afford a lamb, right? That most likely the wise men's gifts are what funded or made possible Mary and Joseph's fleeing to Egypt, because of the gifts that would have enabled them to afford such an unexpected journey. Have you heard that, or do you have any insights on that?
the offering that's mentioned in Luke, not Matthew. But yes, it would have been possibly. We do know that there were a lot of Jews that hid out in Egypt in that part. There was a lot of refugees in there escaping from Herod and persecution in Egypt. Which is go down to Egypt persecution as a Jew. Yeah, that seems wrong.
You know what will be safe?
Egypt.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Yeah, I've heard that. I mean, it makes sense. Because you wonder if Joseph, even in the gifts, if he had received that dowry yet. Maybe he did, maybe he hadn't. Maybe the family took it back. We don't know. We just don't know. And I think the fascinating, and this is just speculation, just going back to the Magi, is why would they have known about the star? Why would they have known? And I go back to just the exile when the Jewish people were in Babylon. That either Daniel or that group of prophets taught, and then that followed through to when these Magi came for whatever sign that they were given back by Daniel and all of those when he was head of Babylon University, teaching them about God and the signs. What did he teach them that we don't have recorded? But that is echoes of that past.
So the wise men, they were from that region of Babylon?
Most likely, they were, they were pagan philosophers.
Yeah.
But how would they have known about a star, which we have nothing, whether a scepter or right out? It's just it's fascinating to think through that.
What I love about that is that kind of goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about breakthrough. If that's how this played out, Daniel, hundreds of years before it was to be lived out, was teaching a truth that was continued on, that eventually finally bore fruit as a breakthrough for some Magi to come and then provide gifts and homage and potentially a means of rescue for the Messiah that are a consequence of what Daniel did hundreds years before. Well, if that's not a beautiful example of breakthrough, that you're doing it now,
you don't know what the implications are.
He was just teaching a lesson.
That's really good.
At that point, but it bore fruit, significant fruit, hundreds of years later.
Also, it speaks to God's universal. He's speaking at all times, everywhere. Which is important as well. You can say something.
Yeah, I just think Charlie kind of hit on it. It's just the faithfulness of Daniel, being cultivated in this fruit for the Messiah. But I think what's crazy is, that Daniel was respected enough by these pagan philosophers, by how he sought after the Lord, that they took what would be to them would probably be considered backwater philosophy and not necessarily useful knowledge, but they treasured it enough to hold on to it and pass it down for generations. Whereas the scribes and the Pharisees, kind of like what we've been talking about, this was their history, their family history, and they were supposed to be in preparation for it. And yet you have people who are not directly tied into the story, related to anybody going on, yet have a greater almost value of the truth in the situation than the Pharisees and the scribes. And I don't know, I just think it's fascinating. I just love it. I think it's so cool.
Even when King Herod says, where is this supposed to take place? And they go back and look. It's like, you should know this. This is your history.
Right next door.
Yeah. Come on. Yeah. This is your history. It's cool. Any final thoughts?
I really like how you wrapped it up. Like the book of Matthew is bookended with the name of Jesus. And it starts off with, this is the account of Jesus, the Messiah. And then what you said here,
God is, I'll be with you.
I'll be with you. And Jesus, Emmanuel, God sent us, and God is with us.
So in the beginning, at the birth, his name, his title is going to be God with us. And as he's going up, he says, and I will be with you always. So I'm always with you from the beginning to the end.
That's good. That's awesome.
Thank y'all. If you heard a bunch of noise in the background, that was our preschool students crying and running down the halls, which is just part of our life here.
Wasn't the studio audience.
Y'all have a great day. Peace.